Mexico City is sinking. Not metaphorically, not gradually in some geological timescale you'll never live to see, but right now, measurably, at a rate that is outpacing every engineering solution humans have thrown at it. 20 inches per year. That's nearly 2 feet of vertical descent every single year in one of the most densely populated urban areas on the planet. And here's what makes this so alarming. It isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. We're not talking about a remote stretch of coastline or an isolated industrial zone. We're talking about a metropolitan area home to roughly 22 million people. A city that generates nearly a quarter of Mexico's entire GDP. A place where cathedrals built in the 1500s are now visibly tilted, where modern subway lines buckle under the stress of ground that simply isn't where it used to be, where engineers patch infrastructure knowing full well the patch won't hold, because the foundation beneath it keeps moving. The question isn't whether Mexico City is sinking. The data on that is unambiguous. The question, the one that scientists, urban planners, and policymakers are wrestling with right now, is what happens when a $200 billion megacity runs out of ground to stand on. And to answer that, we need to start at the very beginning. Because this crisis didn't begin with a pipeline failure or a policy mistake. It began with a lake. 500 years ago, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan sat on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a vast, shallow body of water in the Valley of Mexico, surrounded by mountains on nearly every side. It was an extraordinary feat of engineering for its time. Causeways connected the island to the mainland. Chinampas, artificial floating gardens, extended the cultivable land. The city thrived. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1521 and eventually demolished Tenochtitlan to build Mexico City in its place, they inherited a geography that should have given them pause. Instead, they made a decision that would echo across the next 5 centuries. They began systematically draining Lake Texcoco. Over generations, the lake was reduced through canals, dikes, and eventually massive drainage tunnels. The Grand Canal begun in 1900, being among the most ambitious. By the mid-20th century, the lake was essentially gone. What remained was a vast compressed lakebed of extraordinarily soft, water-saturated clay. And on top of that clay, one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Think of that clay like a dense sponge. When the lake existed, the sponge stayed full. Water pressure from above and below kept the clay relatively stable, compressed but supported. The moment you start pulling water out from beneath, which is exactly what Mexico City began doing at industrial scale as its population exploded in the 20th century, the sponge starts to squeeze. And as it squeezes, it compacts. And as it compacts, the surface drops. This is not a new observation. Engineers in the 1940s were already documenting measurable subsidence. What nobody fully anticipated was the scale the problem would reach, or how thoroughly the city's growth would outpace any effort to address it. Today, Mexico City draws approximately 60% to 70% of its water supply from underground aquifers. The population demands it. The surface infrastructure can't deliver enough from external sources, and so the pumps keep running, thousands of them, pulling water from geological formations that took thousands of years to fill, at rates that replenishment simply cannot match. According to research published by scientists at UNAM, Mexico's National Autonomous University, some areas of the city are now sinking at rates that dwarf even the most alarming projections from a decade ago. The city's historic center has already sunk more than 30 feet since colonial times. Parts of the eastern districts are descending at rates approaching 20 inches annually, and certain monitoring sites have recorded even more. This is what a slow-motion catastrophe looks like. Not a single rupture. Not a day of reckoning with a clear before and after. Just an inexorable, measurable data-confirmed descent, and the cascading consequences that come with it. So what exactly is happening beneath the surface? Because to truly grasp why this is so difficult to reverse, and why it's so much more alarming than a standard infrastructure problem, you need to understand the geology that Mexico City is built on. and it is genuinely unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. The Valley of Mexico sits in a high-altitude basin, roughly 2,240 meters above sea level, ringed by volcanic mountains. When Lake Texcoco filled that basin over thousands of years, it deposited extraordinarily fine-grained sediment, silts and clays so soft and so water-saturated that they behave almost more like a gel than a solid. Geotechnical engineers call this material lacustrine clay, and Mexico City's version of it has some of the highest water content of any urban substrate ever studied. In some layers, the clay is more than 80% water by volume. When you pump water out of an aquifer system, you're removing the fluid that was providing internal pressure to the surrounding sediment. That pressure, called pore water pressure, is what keeps granular and clay-rich soils from fully compacting under the weight of everything above them. Remove the pressure, and the weight wins. The clay particles draw closer together. The sediment layers thin. The surface above drops. This process is called consolidation, and in standard geological materials, some amount of consolidation is reversible. Stop pumping, let the water recharge, and the ground might partially recover. But here's what makes Mexico City's situation so alarming. The consolidation is largely irreversible. Once lacustrine clay compacts to a certain degree, the structural arrangement of the clay particles changes permanently. The microscopic channels that once allowed water to move through the sediment collapse. Refilling the aquifer, even if you could do it, would not fully restore the ground surface. The clay, in essence, has a memory, and once compressed, it doesn't simply spring back. A 2021 study published in the journal JGR Solid Earth led by researchers using satellite radar interferometry, a technique called INSAR that can measure ground deformation to millimeter precision from orbit, mapped the subsidence across Mexico City with unprecedented detail. What the data showed was deeply unsettling. The sinking wasn't uniform. Certain neighborhoods were dropping dramatically faster than surrounding areas. The spatial variation in subsidence rates was creating what the researchers described as differential settling, where adjacent parcels of land sink at different rates, creating shear stresses in buildings, roads, pipelines, and bridges that the structures were never designed to withstand. It's similar to what happens when you place a rigid board across two surfaces that are dropping at different speeds. One end goes down faster than the other. The board doesn't flex, it cracks. And in a city the size of Mexico City, those cracks run through water mains, natural gas lines, wastewater infrastructure, and the foundations of thousands of buildings, many of them old enough that they were constructed without any awareness that the ground beneath them would eventually be moving. The monitoring network operated by UNAM's Institute of Engineering, in collaboration with international partners, has been tracking these deformation patterns with increasing concern. Their data shows that in certain eastern districts, Iztapalapa being among the most documented, subsidence rates are not only high, but spatially chaotic, with some blocks sinking faster than adjacent ones just meters away. The resulting infrastructure damage in these communities is not hypothetical future risk. It is present tense, observable, ongoing destruction. And underneath all of it, the aquifer keeps depleting. According to data from Mexico's National Water Commission, CONAGUA, the city extracts roughly 35 cubic meters of groundwater per second. The recharge rate, meaning how fast water naturally returns, to the aquifer through rainfall infiltration, is a fraction of that. The valley's geology, combined with the impermeable surfaces of an urbanized basin, means that precipitation that should be soaking into the ground is instead running off into drainage systems and being channeled away from the city. The water that took the aquifer thousands of years to accumulate is being consumed in decades. The history of land subsidence around the world offers some sobering reference points and some cautionary tales that Mexico City's planners cannot afford to ignore. Jakarta, Indonesia provides what may be the most direct parallel. For decades, Jakarta drew the majority of its water supply from underground aquifers beneath the city. The result was subsidence rates in some coastal neighborhoods that rivaled or exceeded what Mexico City is experiencing. Parts of North Jakarta sank more than 13 feet over the course of several decades. By the 2010s, roughly 40% of the city sat below sea level. Flooding, which had always been a seasonal inconvenience, became an existential threat. Seawater began intruding into coastal infrastructure. The Indonesian government eventually made the extraordinary decision to move the nation's capital entirely, a project now underway to relocate government functions to the island of Borneo. Jakarta's subsidence crisis contributed directly to that decision. Closer to Mexico City's own history, the experience of Venice offers a longer timeline for understanding what happens to a city built on soft, waterlogged sediment. Venice, built on wooden pilings driven into tidal mudflats, sank measurably throughout. The 20th century, accelerated dramatically by industrial groundwater extraction from the mainland in the mid-century, before Italy implemented strict pumping restrictions in the 1970s. Subsidence slowed considerably, but the city had already sunk enough that flooding events that once occurred a handful of times per century now occurred dozens of times per year. The intervention came in time to prevent catastrophic collapse. Whether it came in time to save Venice from the sea remains an open question. Perhaps the most visceral historical example, however, sits within Mexico City itself. The Metropolitan Cathedral, the largest cathedral in the Americas, construction begun in 1573, stands in the historic Zócalo district as one of the most visible monuments to centuries of differential subsidence. It has tilted, lurched, and settled so unevenly over the centuries that major engineering interventions were required in the 1990s and 2000s just to prevent it from structurally failing. Engineers selectively excavated soil from beneath certain sections of the foundation to deliberately allow those sections to sink and thus re-level the overall structure, a technique called controlled subsidence correction. It worked more or less. The cathedral still stands. But what struck many observers wasn't the success of the intervention. It was what the intervention revealed. That even with extraordinary resources and engineering attention, the most you could do was manage the sinking. You couldn't stop it. In the city's eastern districts, where resources and political attention are considerably scarcer than in the historic center, the consequences are less managed. Residents in communities like Chimalhuacan and Valle de Chalco, areas built on some of the softest former lakebed sediment in the valley, describe watching their homes tilt incrementally year after year. Cracks appear in walls and widen over months. Door frames go out of square. Streets develop undulations so severe that water pools in new depressions with each rainy season. These communities sit atop some of the zones of fastest recorded subsidence, and the families living there have no mechanism to simply relocate to more stable ground. Dr. Enrique Fernandez, a civil engineer who has worked on subsidence-related infrastructure projects in the Mexico City metropolitan area, described the situation in eastern districts in a 2022 interview as not a future risk to be modeled. It is a present reality to be managed, and we are managing it poorly. What are the monitoring systems actually showing right now? And what are the scientists tracking most closely? The primary tool for large-scale subsidence monitoring in Mexico City has become INSAR, Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar, satellite imagery processed to detect ground deformation with millimeter-scale precision across broad geographic areas. Multiple satellite platforms, including ESA's Sentinel-1 constellation, have been systematically imaging the Valley of Mexico, and the data outputs are alarming in their consistency. The highest subsidence zones, primarily in the eastern and northeastern portions of the metropolitan area, show no sign of stabilizing. In fact, several research teams have noted that the rate of sinking in some zones appears to be intensifying, not moderating. On the ground, UNAM's Institute of Engineering operates a network of GPS benchmarks, fixed reference points whose elevation is measured continuously, that provide ground truth data to validate the satellite observations. The two data streams agree. The city is sinking, differentially, and without a clear deceleration trend. CONAGUA, Mexico's national water authority, maintains monitoring wells that track aquifer water levels across the valley. Those records show persistent and in some areas accelerating declines in the water table. In certain monitoring wells, the water table has dropped more than 50 meters over the past several decades. When you visualize that, 50 meters of water column gone from beneath a city that weighs hundreds of millions of tons, the mechanism of surface collapse becomes viscerally intuitive. What scientists can't precisely predict is localized timing and severity. General subsidence trends are measurable and broadly predictable. But where specifically a critical water main will fail, or when differential settlement in a given neighborhood will reach the threshold where buildings become structurally unsafe, that kind of precision is beyond current modeling. What scientists and engineers agree on is that the threshold in many areas is not far off. Several research groups have used the phrase accelerating toward critical in published assessments of Mexico City's eastern zones, a characterization that should concentrate the attention of every urban planner with jurisdiction over the area. The city government has acknowledged the problem. That much is clear from public statements and commissioned studies. What remains deeply contested is whether the policy response is remotely proportional to the scale of the threat. Critics, including several of the researchers whose monitoring data underpins the official reports, argue that water pricing policies, aquifer extraction limits, and investment in alternative water supply infrastructure have all fallen well short of what the subsidence data demands. The gap between what the science says and what the policy implements is, to put it plainly, significant. So what do the scenarios look like if current trends continue? Let's be clear. Scientists cannot tell you exactly when a specific threshold will be crossed, and responsible analysis requires acknowledging the uncertainty in any projection. What models can do is describe the probable shape of cascading consequences, and those descriptions are deeply sobering. At current extraction rates, researchers at UNAM and international partner institutions project that aquifer water levels in the most stressed zones of the valley could continue declining for decades without intervention. Each additional meter of water table decline translates to additional surface subsidence, not uniformly, but concentrated in the zones of softest, most compressible sediment. The models suggest that without significant changes to groundwater management, some eastern districts could experience another meter or more of subsidence over the coming decades. What would that mean in practical terms? The infrastructure cascades could be significant. Mexico City's water distribution network is already estimated to lose roughly 40% of its supply to leaks. Leaks caused, in substantial part, by the differential movement of pipes embedded in sinking, shifting ground. As subsidence continues, those losses could intensify, creating a feedback loop. More leakage means more pressure to pump more groundwater, which drives more subsidence, which causes more leakage. Engineers who have studied the system describe this dynamic as a compounding cycle that becomes progressively harder to interrupt the longer it continues. The wastewater and drainage infrastructure faces similar pressures. Mexico City's drainage system was engineered to flow by gravity in a specific direction at a specific gradient. As the ground sinks unevenly, those gradients change. Some drainage channels that once flowed freely may find their gradient reduced or, in extreme scenarios, reversed, meaning that instead of carrying sewage and stormwater away from populated areas, they could potentially back up into them. During major rainfall events, the consequences of degraded drainage gradients could be severe flooding in areas that were previously protected. For the built environment, the structural risks are similarly compounding. Older buildings in the historic center were often designed with flexible foundations, specifically because colonial-era engineers understood they were building on unstable ground. These structures have shown a certain resilience precisely because they can accommodate some movement. But mid-20th century construction in the outer districts often used rigid concrete foundations designed for stable ground. These structures are the most vulnerable to differential settlement, and there are hundreds of thousands of them across the metropolitan area. Then there is the seismic dimension. Mexico City already sits in a region of significant seismic activity. The 1985 earthquake, which killed an estimated 10,000 people and caused catastrophic structural failures throughout. The city was a devastating demonstration of how the soft lakebed clay amplifies seismic waves. The same geological properties that make the city susceptible to subsidence also make it extraordinarily susceptible to earthquake damage. As differential subsidence continues to stress and weaken building foundations, pipelines, and infrastructure connections, the city's resilience to a future major seismic event could be meaningfully diminished. Researchers at the Mexican Institute of Transportation have noted that subsidence-induced infrastructure degradation and seismic vulnerability are not independent problems. They interact, and their combined risk profile is greater than either alone. None of this is destiny. These are scenarios, not certainties, but they are scenarios grounded in measurable, ongoing physical processes, not speculation. Here is what's easy to miss about Mexico City's crisis. It doesn't announce itself with a shockwave or a column of ash. There's no single day that history will mark as the moment the disaster began. The disaster is already underway, incrementally, measurably, photographable, and that slow burn quality is precisely what makes it so difficult to mobilize against. The same dynamic plays out in other slow-onset environmental crises. We understand it cognitively. The data is there, the mechanisms are understood, the consequences are modeled. But human attention gravitates toward acute events, toward moments of rupture rather than processes of erosion. Mexico City's sinking doesn't give us a moment of rupture. It gives us decades of accumulating damage, each year's increment small enough to normalize, the cumulative total too large to comfortably contemplate. What the science demands, and what the residents of eastern Mexico City are already experiencing in their daily lives, is a policy response calibrated to the actual scale of the threat. That means serious investment in alternative water sources, water recycling infrastructure, rainwater harvesting systems, and the expansion of piped water from surface sources that don't require aquifer depletion. It means pricing and regulatory frameworks that genuinely disincentivize over-extraction. It means urban planning that accounts for where subsidence will be worst and routes critical infrastructure accordingly. And it means resources directed to the communities, the Iztapalapas and the Valle de Chalcos, that are sinking fastest and have the fewest resources to adapt. None of that is simple. All of it is expensive. And the political economy of a city with 22 million people and deeply unequal resource distribution makes every one of those interventions extraordinarily difficult to implement at the scale and speed the data demands. But understanding what is happening, understanding the mechanism, the scale, the stakes, is where every meaningful response begins. Cities have managed subsidence before. Jakarta's crisis forced a reckoning. Venice implemented the restrictions that slowed its sinking. Long Beach, California, which experienced dramatic subsidence in the mid-20th century due to oil extraction, reversed the trend through aggressive water injection programs that partially repressurized the underlying geology. The science of intervention exists. The question is whether the political will can be generated before the cascading consequences of inaction become too large to manage. Mexico City is not Jakarta. It has not yet passed the point where relocation of government functions is being seriously discussed. It is still, in the view of most researchers working on this problem, a city whose trajectory could be meaningfully altered by serious intervention. But the window for that intervention is not unlimited, and the data makes clear that every year of delay narrows it. If you found this examination of Mexico City's subsidence crisis useful, and I hope you did, there's more to explore in this space. The aquifer depletion problem that threatens Mexico City has variations playing out in cities across South Asia, the Middle East, and the American West. Phoenix, Tehran, Chennai. Each one a case study in the collision between urban water demand and finite underground reserves. We'll be going deeper on those in the coming weeks. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of these stories. And if you live in, or have a connection to Mexico City, or to any city dealing with groundwater stress, drop a comment below. The people closest to these problems often see dimensions of them that the satellite data and the scientific papers don't fully capture. This is a community of people who take these threats seriously, and your perspective belongs here. The ground beneath Mexico City is moving. The question of how the city responds, and how quickly, may be one of the defining urban stories of the next half-century.